And welcome to the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. To those who are here in person, and I know we also have participants who are joining us online. My name is Alyssa Ayers, and I'm Dean of the Elliott School. And of course, it is my pleasure to be able to welcome you all and host this book event, which is sponsored by our Institute for International Science and Technology Policy, and of course, our Elliott School Book Launch Series. Now, today, as you all know, we are delighted to host Dr. Anthony Eames, who is co-author of, let's hold it up, Sharing Nuclear Secrets, Trust, Mistrust, and Ambiguity in Anglo-American Nuclear Relations since 1939. Dr. Eames is Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and he is also a longstanding member of our part-time faculty. He's a professorial lecturer with the Elliott School's International Science and Technology Policy MA degree program. He teaches an invaluable course for that program on science diplomacy. You might be reading a lot more about science diplomacy in the news today, but international engagement in S&T is nothing new, and sharing nuclear secrets is a testament to that story. Dr. Eames he is an historian by training, and in his book, he and his co-author, John Bayliss, examine 8 decades of Anglo-American nuclear cooperation. Their analysis of the United States' longest nuclear alliance offers important historical lessons and insights for contemporary issues such as AUKUS, the JCPOA, and more. So I think we all look forward to his talk and to learning more from Dr. Eames in the Q&A that will follow. A very special thanks to Elliott School Professor Aaron Bateman, who will be moderating the Q&A, and of course to Dr. Eames for taking the time to present your book and let us celebrate it here today. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Eames. Congratulations, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Ayers, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Elliott School for hosting these book launch series conversations. It's great to know what your colleagues and other people about town are working on, and in the best case circumstance, you can bring it into your own work. And thank you in advance to Aaron, who will most certainly provide some much needed polish on these rants and ramblings that are about to take place. I see a number of my former students in the audience today, and hopefully some are online. So it is their turn to grill me on a presentation, as I've done to them over the years. So let me kind of lay out how I want to discuss this book. I'll give you, of course, the origins of the book. Any good book talk has to cover the origins of the book. And I'll get into, after that, kind of a discussion of special relationship scholars and how they see that relationship. I'll layer in a discussion of trust theory and the developments in trust theory over the last couple of decades. And I'll do my best to finish with a case study or two that really illustrates the kind of things we're discussing on a theoretical terms. So first, how did this book come to be? John Bayliss reached out a few years ago, and for those of you who don't know John Bayliss, John is the Dean of British Nuclear History. He has been writing on British nuclear history and Anglo-American nuclear relations for many decades, in fact, more years than I've been alive. John's known for one of the kind of authoritative accounts on US-UK defense relations, which again came out before I was born. So I was thrilled to have the invitation from John to join him in writing this book. And what are the things we wanted to accomplish in writing this book? The first thing we wanted to do is reconcile British and American perspectives on this relationship. If you look at people who've written on Anglo-American relations or Anglo-American nuclear relations, frankly, it's rare that you ever get an American and British scholar working together. Occasionally, you'll get a collection of essays here and there with a token American in a British volume or the token British scholar in an American volume. But rarely do you actually get people co-authoring together, right? That process of having to write within another person's voice and expand their arguments and then have them ping it back to you and do the same for you. And that proved really an invaluable process for the both of us in this book, and not just this book, but how we think of the relationship. So it was a bit of special relationship in practice, if you will. And I will say, if I'm going to be tongue-in-cheek and a bit reductive about our disagreements of how the book take place, it usually centered around something like this. John's content was basically The Americans were a little dishonest from time to time and went back on their word on some agreements and took British contributions for granted. And my view was maybe the British are a little entitled to the fruits of American labor and knowledge and know-how. These kind of, somewhat tongue-in-cheek debates played out, but generally we kind of operated in good faith and kind of were able to work past those somewhat reductive views. Second, we wanted to discuss trust theory because trust theory is kind of a line of ideas that has been developed in social science scholarship in the last 2 decades or so, and really has taken hold in the IR literature in the last 15 years. But most of what has been written within this kind of school of trust theory revolves around adversarial relationships. Specifically, the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and even more specifically, Reagan and Gorbachev are often seen as the kind of fundamental case study in trust theory and how to build trust between enemies. Now, when we did see trust theory kind of discussed in an alliance case, it was generally discussed in multilateral alliances. How do you build trust within a group? These are things we certainly contemplated, especially since we were looking at a bilateral alliance that was really the anchor of a multilateral alliance, that being NATO. So we wanted to kind of dig into that issue. And last, we wanted to write a big book. And we wanted to write a big book from a chronological standpoint and a methodological standpoint. One, there really isn't a study out there that covers the entire span of the Anglo-American nuclear relationship. There are a few studies that cover the entire span of the American nuclear program or the British nuclear program, especially if you look in the British case, there's the official histories of the British nuclear deterrent. That is not one single study, it's a collection of volumes that have been carried kind of decade over decade by 3 or 4 historians now. But we wanted something that could really speak to the durability of the relationship. And also, when you're talking about trust theory, what is trust? Well, fundamentally, trust is an anticipation of future events and interactions. So we needed to measure those expectations against outcomes and then see how the relationship sustained and was endured, or endured and was sustained. And lastly, we kind of wanted to see how trust theory, or how I should say, the relationship survived in moments of transition in world affairs. Right? Of course, you can see this in the beginning of the Cold War when you transition from World War II to the Cold War, but we also very much wanted to see how it survived at the end of the Cold War. And we wanted to look at these moments in particular because this undermines what is one of the major camps in special relationship scholarship known as the functionalist camp. I'll get a little bit to speak to a little bit about what functionalism is and the computing school when I talk about why we took a kind of an interdisciplinary approach to this volume. You heard me talk a lot about IR scholarship, and as Dean Ayers pointed out, I'm a historian. So we wanted to write something that was methodologically diverse so we could appeal to political scientists, we could appeal to historians and other people who are interested in this relationship. In part because our superficial observation was generally we found that political scientists and social scientists kind of were more slotted toward the functionalist perspective, and historians were more slotted toward the evangelical sentimental camp. Okay, so what are those two camps? Well, the functionalist camp on special relationships is this. It's an interest-based relationship rooted in the opposition to a common enemy, right? Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, maybe today the Chinese Communist Party. But that kind of interest-based relationship will be doomed to fail. It'll be doomed to fail because of the evolving dimensions of international relations. It'll also be doomed to fail because of the subtle and not so subtle differences within the United States and the United Kingdom. Nation state versus union state. Federal republic, constitutional monarchy, two-party democracy, parliamentary democracy. Pretty significant geographic and demographic differences. And the functionalist would state that, in kind of the most severe perspective, that not only is this relationship doomed to fail, but that the US had distorted British interests during the Cold War, and that led to British decline on the world stage. Now, what's the other camp say? That kind of evangelical, sentimental camp, to which I adhere, views the English language, kind of cultural affinities as key to keeping that relationship together. I mean, I'm going to go out and guess that most of you in the audience have probably, listened to the Beatles or watched The Crown on Netflix rather than, I don't know, read the recent British Strategic Defense Review. Even in this group, I would suspect that that would be the case. I mean, I could see a few faces that maybe would prove me wrong. But we also go a step further and say that culture, of course, conditions interest, conditions how one defines interests, right? So that was something we would try to pull out throughout the thread of this book. Now, let me do a case to try to layer in trust theory and how we looked at trust theory. Well, to start, when you talk about trust theory, choose a modifier, put it in front of the word trust, and you'll find a theory. You'll see moralistic trust and particular trust and calculative trust and strategic trust and bonded trust. These are all theories that have been fully developed and expressed in the literature. I am not going to recount each of them for you since I just did that with special relationship scholarship. But the most basic definition of trust is the expectation that no harm will be done when betrayal is a possibility. So, one, this definition is largely crafted again in the context of adversarial relations, right? It seems like a pretty low bar for allies. Don't hurt me. That's all we need to be allies and friends, right? That's a pretty low bar. But it's also a definition that was developed when we see through the lens of a state, and exclusively the lens of a state. But when you start seeing through the lens of a nuclear society that's comprised not just of government officials, but of scientific communities, of cultural producers and actors, of kind of the general public and ordinary citizens, the academic class and journalists, you get a kind of much more multifaceted relationship, and trust thus becomes functionally ambiguous, right? Because, for example, I may trust John Bayliss, my fellow academic in Britain who's interested in nuclear politics, but I may not trust someone in the Ministry of Defense who has perhaps a bigger say on the kind of direction of the nuclear policies in Britain. Or I might not trust a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament who advocates for unilateral nuclear abolition, right? So there are a lot of stakeholders in this nuclear partnership, and you can't just go ahead and say there's 100% trust or zero trust in the relationship. It's a layer cake that you have to evaluate kind of step by step. When you look at that kind of multi-stakeholder relationship, what becomes apparent is boundary actors or boundary spanners or intermediaries, these terms are somewhat interchangeable, are very important for the sustainability of the relationship. Okay, what do I mean by a boundary actor? Well, I think probably a lot of you have seen Oppenheimer. In some ways, Oppenheimer is one of the first boundary actors. And what a boundary actor is able to do is translate their belonging in one community into expertise in another community. Right? So Oppenheimer could translate his belonging in the scientific community into expertise with kind of military officials. He's speaking for the whole of the scientific community. That is an expert role. It's someone who can speak to a president or a prime minister on one day, speak to a fellow scientist on the next day, speak to a college freshman on the day after that, and speak to a parish pastor on Good Friday, all about important nuclear questions and ethical dilemmas. So boundary actors are quite important there. I'm going to say two more things on this kind of trust theory issue, and then I'll get into the fun kind of empirical case studies, right? Because we've had enough theory. One, we didn't do a quantitative model. Why didn't we do a quantitative model? Well, we found that this relationship is somewhat resistant to quantitative modeling, in part because the relationship is kind of built on not just formalized agreements like the Polaris sales agreement or the Trident sales agreement, but also ad hoc arrangements. For example, basing of delivery vehicles, and kind of nuclear intelligence arrangements and understandings between presidents and prime ministers. And so in each of those arrangements, you can't really say that the ad hoc arrangement is an indicator of zero trust or complete trust. In some cases, the ad hoc arrangement is an indicator of complete trust between, say, the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force, but complete distrust in US Congress and British Parliament. And I'll kind of speak specifically to what I'm talking about here in the case studies. So those kind of contextual issues with judging ad hoc arrangements and informal or formal agreements make it kind of resistance quantitative model. Lastly, I want to talk about some important contributions we kind of make to trust theory. And I'll talk about three kind of categories or three effects. First is the issue of reciprocity, specifically categories. First, reciprocation. You need to understand, when is an offer for cooperation to initiate kind of deeper trust in the relationship supposed to take part solely within nuclear parameters? That is the sharing of knowledge, the exchange of hardware, kind of collaborations on deterrence policy and targeting policy, intelligence cooperation, but all something that touch nuclear issues. Or should reciprocity be expanded to kind of be linked up to broader objectives in US and UK foreign policy, right? Should one exchange kind of nuclear information with the understanding that you're going to kind of vote the right way or influence discussions the right way on matters of European integration and British application to the common market in the 1970s? So linkage, essentially, and reciprocity are key here. Second, the observation effect. As you might suspect, Werner Heisenberg's name occasionally came up in discussions when we were working on the earlier chapters. Heisenberg, of course, is the father of quantum theory and was the head of the German atomic project in World War II. And one of the things we know from quantum theory is that observation affects positionality, right? That measurement affects positionality. And this is not just quantum physics, this is cultural anthropology. There's plenty of cases where we know this. And in the context of trust theory, we kind of saw the same things. Because if trust is an expectation that no harm will be done, again, at its most basic level, when you start to add more and more people to the relationship, now you have to contend with more and more expectations. And you also have to contend with how people define harm, right? So as more people join this relationship, first in legislative bodies, then kind of the general public and the cultural aspects of it, trust changes. And lastly, we talk about the compound trust effect, which is essentially reputational lending, right? I'm going to say here that Aaron is trustworthy, and I'm going to say that to Dean Ayers, and that's a sign of immense trust on my part. And if you prove me right that you are trustworthy, then that deepens our relationship. So those are kind of three important theoretical contributions we seek to make. Now, let's get into the empirical evidence. I'm not going to pretend that in any of the cases that we kind of, we've discussed, and we did do our best to really cover the whole span of the relationship. I will say that intelligence matters were less of our focus, and really what was our focus was cooperation on the deterrent itself. But I'll point out some studies or some episodes that surprised us. And I think what we can do is we can start with the depth of rivalry that actually took place during the kind of World War II atomic bomb project, and eventually the Manhattan Project. Now, again, nice thing about Oppenheimer coming out last year is everyone in this room has probably seen it. I don't have to recount the details of the Manhattan Project. What was lost in Oppenheimer was the British contribution and debates about Britain's role in the project. Those debates initially start even before kind of research begins at Los Alamos and other places, because the person the British named to head the project on their end is a guy named W.A. Ackers, who heads Imperial Chemistry or Imperial Chemical Industries. And at the same time, the British say that he's going to head the atomic bomb project. They're also trying to alleviate American anxieties over potential British exploitation of the commercial utility of atomic power. Because before the war, the United States and the United Kingdom had been engaged in a series of fierce kind of trade battles, right? And disagreements over free trade around the world and protectionist measures and whatnot. And frankly, the Brits had often gotten the better of the Americans. At least that was the sentiment in Washington. So this is kind of like someone saying, don't worry, I know this, advanced satellite technology has both military and commercial applications. And I know we put Elon Musk in charge of it, but we're sticking strictly to security dimensions, not the commercial, right? So the Americans are kind of very highly distrustful of this, and initially kind of seek to go it alone without British help. Eventually, these dynamics kind of reverse, and finally, we settle in 1943 through kind of great work between Roosevelt and Churchill that a joint effort should be made. The key person on the British side who was able to kind of build trust between the British scientific community and the US military is a guy named James Chadwick. James Chadwick at this time had already won a Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize for discovering the neutron, highly respected physicist, and becomes the daily briefer for Groves on scientific projects. It's not Oppenheimer, it's Chadwick. Groves doesn't really like Oppenheimer that much. They have fundamentally different personality types. And Oppenheimer is, of course, pushing back on all sorts of things that Groves presents, like compartmentalization. But Chadwick firmly understands compartmentalization, respects it, doesn't push Groves on it. He firmly expresses a kind of almost a dismay about the commercial applications of atomic power, thinks it should be really just a security issue, and is the primary author of the MAUD report, Military Applications of Uranium Detonation, which is brought over by the British delegation early in World War II to convince the Americans that they need to start investing in atomic energy. So that starts to build kind of trust between the British scientific community, the British technical community, and the American military. At the same time, at the kind of head of state level, Churchill and Roosevelt famously have a good relationship, and kind of holds true here as well. And they reached two agreements, Quebec Agreement and Hyde Park Understanding, Hyde Park Agreement. These agreements are famously not disseminated widely within the United Kingdom and the United States. In fact, the Hyde Park Agreement, in which both Prime Minister and President essentially decide to extend nuclear cooperation in perpetuity, is misfiled by the Americans. If I'm recalling correctly, I think it's a naval attaché who misfiles the report. It's lost, and the Americans refuse to accept the British copy of this agreement. And so what happens is when time comes to legislate on how to control atomic energy in the United States, this isn't here to inform the process. But before I get to that piece of legislation, we quickly see kind of a breakdown in trust in the relationship. Why? The Smythe Report is released in 1945, which is essentially an administrative history of the Manhattan Project. Not essentially, it is an administration history of the Manhattan Project. And this report is seen as a kind of a down payment on international cooperation control of atomic energy by the United States. The British think they're the ones making the down payment out of their bank account, right? Because the American lead is in its industrial capacity. They have built the infrastructure to produce atomic weaponry. The British don't have that lead. Decisions, of course, were made to cooperate with the Americans because their own industrial infrastructure was vulnerable during the war. The lead they do have is a knowledge lead. over every other country on Earth, including the Soviet Union at this time, even though there was significant atomic espionage going on. So the British say, like, oh my God, how can we trust you? You're kind of giving away the crown jewels here without our consent, which is supposed to be the case. And so that is followed up by the McMahon Act. The McMahon Act in 46 essentially bans the sharing of nuclear knowledge and hardware between the United States and any other country, including Canada and the UK, who worked with them on the Manhattan Project. But again, it's not informed by the Hyde Park Understanding because it was misfiled. Brienne McMahon is actually an avowed internationalist. He is not an isolationist. He's writing this bill actually as a kind of hedge against a much more severe option, which would be the May-Johnson bill, which would have kind of installed military control over the US atomic program and kind of cut off all pathways for possible international cooperation. So this is a real issue, again, for kind of building trust between the countries. In fact, very little trust actually exists at this time. But since the McMahon Act does leave open the prospect, or not leave open, mandate civilian control of the act, there are possibilities for future collaboration. And again, the McMahon Act mostly attends to kind of questions of hardware and knowledge. It leaves open the possibility of cooperation in other areas like intelligence, uranium ore sharing, whatnot. And it leaves open the possibility of kind of ad hoc arrangements growing up, emerging organically, if you will. One of these big ad hoc arrangements is the modus vivendi in 1948, which is a very significant atomic intelligence agreement. But perhaps the most significant ad hoc arrangement that emerges, and an indicator that this kind of trust relationship is ambiguous, is the Berlin blockade happens in 1948. Right? The US and the UK don't reach any formal agreement on the basing of US B-29 bombers in the United Kingdom. There's no formal agreement on this. This is simply an ad hoc arrangement between the United States Air Force and the Royal Air Force. And why is this significant? Because B-29 bombers are, of course, the delivery vehicle for American nuclear warheads at this time. So you have enormous tensions in the heart of Europe with kind of uncertainty over whether US nuclear weapons are stationed in Britain and if Britain will become a forward base for a US nuclear strike. The Brits see this as kind of a gambit to kind of rope in US dependence on Britain's geography, on its strategic geography, to combat the Soviet Union. And they start to try to build different opportunities for trust at the same time. I should note that British Parliament and US Congress were responding to vastly different public opinions. For Britain, there was a real concern about the nuclear age essentially damning its right to sovereignty. And George Orwell writes about this in late October 1945, I believe, where he talks about the growth of the Cold War, two nuclear armed superpowers, and basically a two-block world. The British very much see the atomic age as a threat to national sovereignty. Americans, on the other hand, are pretty jubilant about an atomic utopia with energy too cheap to meter and American security kind of run rampant around the world based on its atomic monopoly. So these kind of little side agreements, little ad hoc arrangements kind of develop over the next few years until ultimately the Sputnik shock kind of sends a wake-up call to the British and American defense communities, and nuclear collaboration is renewed with the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement. I'm going to jump ahead, though, to the 1970s. Even though the 1960s, for people who know this kind of relationship very well, has some very juicy material, specifically on the Skybolt affair. It's kind of well-trod ground, and will surely take me another 20 minutes to go through, which we don't have. So I'm going to jump ahead to the 1970s. The 1970s is a really interesting case. So what are the political headers of the 1970s? You have European integration and you have detente. And what are the hardware issues in the nuclear relationship in the 1970s? Well, the hardware issue at hand is really whether or not the United States should supply multiple independent reentry vehicles to the United Kingdom, known as Poseidon. So the Poseidon MERD class, which would upgrade Polaris missile system on UK submarines. And these were seen as needed to overcome advances in Soviet ABM technology, anti-ballistic missile defense technology, that were very much kind of going through an evolution in the late 60s and 70s. And of course, a focus of arms control talks between the United States and the Soviet Union. But this supply of MERV technology becomes linked to those broader foreign policy objectives, in part because the leaders of these countries both are realists. Everyone knows Nixon and Kissinger are realists. I mean, they're the arch kind of practitioners of realpolitik. Something that's very much not talked about is Heath. Ted Heath is very much a realist. In fact, he goes on record in in Foreign Affairs talking about how much of a realist he is in the late 1960s, and very much seeks to reverse the flow of influence, whereby Britain would serve as a conduit for European views in Washington rather than as a proxy for American views in Europe. Right? So these are the kind of dynamics at play. What Britain wants to do is leverage its nuclear knowledge, some of its hardware, in conversations with France about its ability to join the common market in 1973. British economic struggles are frankly a tale as old as time since the end of World War II. And in the 1970s, they are really encountering kind of a sluggish economy. And so joining the common market takes on a certain urgency. And at the same time, French had recently become a nuclear power in their own right, withdrawn from NATO's integrated command structure, both their conventional and nuclear forces, and are seeking a sort of rapprochement with the Soviet Union. So the possibility of atomic collaboration with the UK is actually very attractive. Now, the Americans don't want the British to, one, give away nuclear secrets that they jointly developed. In fact, it's expressly forbidden. You cannot share jointly developed nuclear knowledge or technology, in part because it's a carrot of their own. It's a carrot of their own to get the French to avoid what Nixon and Kissinger are calling differentiated detente. Right? Nixon and Kissinger are advocating for a detente managed on bilateral terms between Moscow and Washington, not on multilateral in terms in which Moscow and its Warsaw Pact allies can kind of selectively relax tensions with different Western states to improve their own standing. Probe for daylight. Classic Russian strategy, of course, right? You probe for daylight in the West. So this really becomes the issue around which Nixon and Kissinger say, we are not going to supply you MERV Poseidons. We will supply you demerved Poseidons, but we're not going to supply you MERV Poseidons unless you kind of get on board with how we see detente. And detente is really being managed through a series of processes, both arms control between the superpowers, but multilateral forums for human rights discussions and for management of conventional forces in Europe between the Warsaw Pact and NATO allies. Ultimately, the Brits say, you know what, we're going to go at our own, and we're going to pursue the development of what is known as Super Antelope program, later renamed Cheveline, which is a ballistic missile with a series of kind of decoys on the bus, which would allow it to defeat sophisticated anti-ballistic missile defense systems. And this does become very important, actually, as we go into the 1980s, because it becomes a very important kind of technical feat or technical reference point as the United States seeks to develop its strategic defense initiative. But how does this all tie back to trust theory? Well, the real issue at play, if you look at this kind of realist turn in US-UK relations, is the issue of linkage, right? Up until this point, US-UK nuclear relations, yeah, they had occasionally been tied to other things, but they were kind of fundamentally their own thing, right? Reciprocation kind of fundamentally happened around nuclear issues. And now, as we embrace this realist turn, both the US government and the UK government are struggling to define the ways in which it should link kind of its atomic relationship, its nuclear relationship to other aspects of US UK foreign policy, especially as those foreign policies really do diverge. And as Britain kind of seeks to manage its decline on a global stage into being a more regional power, which, by the way, not just Nixon and Kissinger are upset with, so is Johnson. Nixon and Kissinger accept that they see Britain as a regional power, but they're at the same time upset that Britain refuses to kind of continue to look globally. So they accept that they're a regional power, but man, they should really look globally. And so there's a little bit of inconsistency there, and I suppose not surprising. But the outcome is also positive because eventually the British are able to kind of prove their worth to the Americans and prove their own technical know-how, which again becomes very invaluable as we head into the 1980s. So let me say a little something about the 1980s, and I'll try to get to the post-Cold War period, and I'll keep it over here. And looking, we're about almost 40 minutes in, and we'd like to get to Q&A. You know, the 1980s is an interesting period, right? Reagan and Thatcher are kind of the main characters here, but so are the anti-nuclear movements. They're very critical to the relationship at this time. And the decade has a lot of episodes, right? It has the Trident Sales Agreement, which is the kind of major nuclear deterrent enforced both in the United States and the United Kingdom today, going upgrades for the Dreadnought class and the Columbia class. But those weapon systems are still the key deterrent. You had kind of debates and deployment about intermediate range nuclear forces, eventually lead to the INF Treaty, which had been the most successful arms control treaty until 2016. Right, so you have all sorts of things going on, but most critically, you have probably the Strategic Defense Initiative, something that you can learn more about reading Aaron's forthcoming book. I'm much better at pitching other people's books than my own book. And the kind of arms control agreements at the end of the Cold War and those summits. But what are some of the surprising elements of mistrust at play? SDI and the Reykjavik summit, in which Reagan initially agrees to give away, not give away, but almost gets to the point of agreeing with Gorbachev to abolish nuclear weapons. There is some debate about whether they were talking strictly about ICBMs or all nuclear weapons, but Thatcher practically loses her mind on both SDI and the Reykjavik summit, because here she spent all this political capital saying nuclear weapons are essential to British security and deterrence. It's fundamental to how Britons see their way in the world. And then Reagan's saying, we're just going to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And there's also a series of kind of technical and commercial issues at play about brain drain and Britain's high, evolution in a high-tech economy. So what does Thatcher ultimately decide to do? She ultimately decides to say, it's still better to remain in lockstep with Reagan's evolution on nuclear policy rather than kind of publicly hash out the differences between the Reagan administration and the Thatcher government in NATO summits, like in the G7 at Williamsburg, but also in conversations directly with Gorbachev. Gorbachev actually falls into this kind of routine where ahead of every meeting with Reagan, he meets with Thatcher. And this begins in December 84 and happens pretty much in every summit beforehand. And this is where we get into the Comtown trust effect. Thatcher has severe reservations about the way Reagan's approaching nuclear policy, and nonetheless lends her reputation to Reagan's nuclear policies with Gorbachev. Says he's trustworthy and he knows what he's doing. That's that. And that really does kind of cement what we now consider the kind of political soulmates relationship between Reagan and Thatcher. One other point, though, the anti-nuclear movements, especially in Britain, had a severe anti-American dimension to it. You might think that anti-nuclear movements would be bad for a nuclear relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, but we actually found the opposite. Right? We found that the more links between countries, between nuclear establishments, between nuclear societies, the better, the more durable, the more robust. Because in one way, you have an anti-nuclear conversation or part of the population in Britain somewhat confident that the same conversation is happening in open, democratic spaces that civil society is functioning correctly and kind of engaging in these questions about nuclear weapons and the utility of nuclear weapons. And also, if you look at where the kind of spectrum of ideas about the utility of nuclear weapons exists in the United Kingdom and the United States, it's different in the 1980s. In the United States, the main thrust of the anti-nuclear movement is freeze. Okay, that doesn't mean get rid of nuclear weapons. That means freeze production and deployments and whatnot, but you still have an operational deterrent. In the United Kingdom, the main thrust is abolition. Get rid of them all, kick US weapons off British territory, and in some cases actually leave NATO. But as that debate develops in Britain, you start to see more interactions with the nuclear freeze movement. It starts to kind of moderate the British anti-nuclear positions. And especially a party like the Liberal Democrats actually end up kind of adopting that freeze position and carve out a middle ground and really do cut into Labor's chances of, which were not very real, by the way, but really do cut into Labor's status as the kind of loyal opposition in Parliament vis-a-vis Thatcher's government. But, you know, it's again, the basis is this, that both the British society and American society come to accept that we should be having conversations about the utility of nuclear weapons and international security together, not apart. And that, in a sense, very much builds trust in the relationship. I'll make a quick comment on where we've come post-Cold War. It's no longer really about the perpetuation of the deterrent. That issue was kind of centered by Bush and Blair in 2006 with an exchange of letters, which basically said that Brits had access to a variety of life sustainment programs and life extension programs for their hardware and warheads. It's really become a kind of a non-proliferation focus, and that's where the tension is in the relationship, specifically over JCPOA. But it is no longer about the kind of deterrent hardware itself. And to some extent, the greatest thing you can say about a trusting relationship is when it becomes routine and boring and monotonous, right? The kind of nuclear questions that once occupied the attention of presidents and prime ministers don't really do so much anymore in the context of US-UK relationships. They much more fall to civil servants and some political appointees, but it's not as important an issue as it once was. I have some comments, I guess, about why this study is kind of important for others, but I think it's a good chance to turn this over to Q&A and Aaron to put some, like I said, spit shine this rant and rave into a polished product.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, thanks, Anthony. Fantastic talk. So before Q&A, I just want to make a couple of comments. I think the trust piece is really, really important. Because I remember a British official saying to me one time, someone in the UK Ministry of Defense, he said, talking about Polaris in particular, said a Polaris SLBM looks the same, whether it's coming from a British submarine or an American submarine going towards Moscow. And so there's a high degree of trust in that relationship when it actually comes to the control and employment of British nuclear weapons, putting questions of independent deterrent aside. But what I want to ask you, Anthony, is this about the sustainment of the relationship. Because I think it would be easy to assume that the relationship is sustained between presidents and prime ministers. But when you talk to people, especially at AWE in the UK, at the US labs, you oftentimes find a really unique degree of collaboration. There's an infrastructure in place that allows seamless sharing of highly sensitive information. And so I wonder if you can talk about the sustainment of the relationship and in the balance between elite political actors and mid-level personnel in both establishments. And then the second question is about thinking about the lessons of Anglo-American nuclear cooperation for AUKUS in particular, and thinking about UK motivations for being involved in AUKUS. And is this a completely different set of circumstances, or do we see similarities? Thanks.
So AUKUS and sustainment. I'll start with sustainment. Probably the most important part of the sustainment equation is what we call the JOWOGs, the joint working groups that work on any number of technical problems. There's been well over 30 of these joint working groups over the years that emerge out of the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement. And these are groups that fully comprised of kind of I don't want to say an equal split, but very much British and American scientists dealing with very practical problems in maintaining a nuclear deterrent. What should we, what materials should be used in the construction of a nuclear submarine hull, right? How do we achieve desired accuracy effects for submarine launched ballistic missiles? So that technical kind of formalized structure has been very important over the years. What's also very important is that in these technical groups, there's a fuller appreciation for the political environments of both countries. It is absolutely imperative for technical experts or academics to kind of continue to re-educate their colleagues on either across the Atlantic on what the political realities are. I know, for example, Aaron, you and I have both been members of the Charterhouse Conference in the UK. I think you were just there this past year, right? The Charterhouse Conference in the UK is held by the Aldermaston Weapons Establishment. Anytime an American goes, and there's not too many of us who go, but it seems that you're always getting kind of grilled on the current American political climate, because understanding the political realities kind of sets the limits of possible for the relationship. And so there's that, continuing re-education process, and was very significant, by the way, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when kind of the architecture for science policy advising was evolving around, for example, PSAC, which is kind of abolished in the 70s, right, under Nixon. Different kind of developments take place under Reagan. The JASONs, which are an important group in the United States, there was a thought to kind of establish a JASONs group, technical advisory, non-government officials in the UK to mirror the US science policy advising infrastructure so as to better kind of create common outcomes on the nuclear deterrent. That didn't come to pass. But it's understanding how those technical kind of developments relate to the political is key for the sustainment part, which goes to the boundary actor thing. And on the college rule, I mean, this is about just getting more people to think seriously about the nuclear partnership is actually always a good thing. Maybe it's a bit idealistic on my part, but it's a conversation that we should be having together, because to your point, Moscow is not going to determine the difference between a Polaris missile launched from a British boat versus an American boat. AUKUS. You might have more things to say about AUKUS than I have. I mean, AUKUS, I don't want to say was an afterthought in this book, but when we were finishing this book, AUKUS was just being announced. And as so often happens, once you finish a book, you kind of close your eyes for a little bit and don't want to think seriously about it. The one thing that I don't want to say brought a smile to my face, but was keenly apparent is, wow, the French are always on the outside looking in. And the French have desperately kind of wanted some version of a nuclear triumvirate for, several decades now. And this is just kind of one more iteration. But on the flip side, when we think about that kind of realist question and how the United States and US policymakers have seen nuclear cooperation as a way to not shape entirely, give a nudge to their British counterparts about how to see the world and how to see themselves as regional actors or as global actors, I think AUKUS is a good indicator of that. Right. I mean, in the absence or in the aftermath of Brexit, it is certainly a lifeline to the British to say, do your best to resume some sort of global role. In fact, we're kind of doing the opposite of Dean Acheson, right? And kind of jabbing at the British that they've lost an empire, not found a role. We're trying to help them find a role in the case of AUKUS. So, that's speculative, yes, admittedly, but that's somewhat how I see it right now. Ask me in a few more months when I dig into it a little bit more and have some more conversations with people on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'll have firmer views on AUKUS.
Right. So now we'll open it up to the floor for Q&A.
We have a question from the online audience. Can you comment on the impact Klaus Fuchs had on the mistrust in the Anglo-American relationship?
Right.
Comment on the impact Klaus Fuchs had on the relationship.
Klaus Fuchs. Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, a huge impact. Klaus Fuchs was he wasn't a British scientist, but he was a British national who participated in the Manhattan Project and gave access to Manhattan Project secrets to the Soviets. You can't really isolate Fuchs, by the way. There's other spy scandals happening in Britain at the time, and also the British scientific community is becoming somewhat hostile to the onset of nuclear deterrence as the kind of prevailing security regime for the US and UK. Patrick Blackett, who's a very well-known, very well-respected British physicist, actually Australian physicist, I should say, working in Britain, British national, comes out with a book, top of my mind, what is it? Something like Fear in Nuclear Weapons or something. And it's basically a Soviet apologist or account. And you also have at the same time kind of the rise of the social welfare state in Britain, right? So amidst the Klaus Fuchs scandal and amidst the onset of McCarthyism in the United States and the kind of arrival of the social welfare state and kind of serious opposition amongst the technical class in Britain, those things all come together and yes, very much do damage the relationship. And things do kind of go cold a little bit between Truman and Attlee and then Truman and Churchill later on whether or not we can trust each other at a society level. But I mean, ultimately, like I said, Sputnik kind of saves all. Sends a good wake-up call.
So you've gone to this almost adversarial relationship to what I would consider a great Five Eye relationship, both not only in military, but even in emergency management across the pond. How did this transition happen?
Yeah, so I don't want to state too strongly that it's, that it's adversarial from the start, right? They're rivals, but certainly not adversaries. This is where there is a case to be made for functionalism, right? I admitted that I was a bit more in the evangelical sentimental camp and the functionalist camp, but that doesn't mean it's either or, right? One sometimes spurs the other. I mean, I think it's very obvious that the threat of Nazi Germany is what spurs the kind of relationship between the two. Without the possibility of a Nazi bomb, put together by the world's most advanced physics community at the time, although suffered kind of serious losses, right, for obvious reasons. Yeah, this would not have come together, very obviously. But what sustains it are the kind of growth of those cultural links, as I pointed out. One of the things we didn't talk about was the emergence of kind of dissident voices during the Manhattan Project, which again, the more links, the better, because this conversation is understood that we should be having this together. So Joseph Rotblat is the only kind of dissenting scientist in the Manhattan Project. Once Germany is defeated, the technical community all believed that they were working on a bomb to defeat the Nazis, not the Japanese. And once the target is switched to Japan, Rotblat resigns, right? Because clearly the mission has been distorted. Rotblat goes on to found Pugwash with a number of other British and American scientists, which becomes, initially suspected of being a communist front, but eventually becomes kind of the premier body of international scientific citizens around the world, and very much leads on conversations about nuclear abolition. But again, the relationship is sustained because the conversation is happening together. British and Americans realize that they can't make up their minds without the other, about the place of nuclear weapons. So it's just this kind of commitment to continue and engage in the conversation with each other that happens at all those levels of society. We take something like on the cultural front, like Dr. Strangelove. Dr. Strangelove is based on a British book. It's an American film sensation, but it's a British book. And the British book is based on the Colonel Zink affair, which is a British colonel who sees American bombers taking off of British bases without British consent, right? Because those bombers had been there on an ad hoc basis. And so it is this kind of, there's contingency in history, of course. But we see the relationship kind of grow out in all directions. It is not kept in secret. And that's the key. It is not kept in secret. It's allowed to kind of flourish.
This is on good. No, wonderful presentation and discussion. Anthony, thank you so much for that. You covered lots of crises, and you were hinting at it in your last comments. Which one threatened the infrastructure of trust in the relationship the most? What did that tell you about the fabric of trust when it is at the boundary?
Sure. I mean, there's, I don't want to say the McMahon Act because frankly, the infrastructure hadn't become institutionalized. Now, the trust really only existed at interpersonal levels. It hadn't become institutionalized at that point. I would say that the Skybolt affair is very serious. And it's an interesting dynamic. So basically, the US and UK had agreed that the US would develop a Skybolt air-launched cruise missile, and the British would seek development work on their own Blue Streak missile, which was a liquid-fueled ICBM. Many of you know that solid-fueled rockets are much better than liquid-fueled rockets, but even then, Skybolt was plagued with technical problems from the start, plagued with kind of budget problems from the start. And this has started to be detected in the Eisenhower administration. But it becomes more pronounced when McNamara comes into DOD under Kennedy and kind of reformats DOD's procurement processes and ways of assessing kind of budgetary priorities. And the kind of DOT's technical personnel very early start to indicate that Skybolt isn't going to be something we supply the British, or sorry, isn't going to be something we developed. And of course, we're not going to just develop for the sake of the British, right? We're going to develop it for ourselves and the British. But this is where explaining the political realities sets the limit of possible is important. Solly Zuckerman, who's in my mind one of the premier science advisors of the Cold War, at this time was the chief science advisor in the Ministry of Defense, eventually becomes chief science advisor in the British government, is the one kind of fielding this incoming from his American colleagues saying, Skybolt isn't going to work. It has so many technical problems. It is so expensive. You need to start kind of adjusting the way you think about it. He's largely ignored. And why is he largely ignored? Because the British kind of nuclear establishment is captured by US Air Force objectives. The US Air Force is the one who's developing Skybolt. This is a budget game, right? This is classic inter-service rivalry, right? And they're thinking, man, if we get the Brits on board, how are you going to cancel this project? It's so key to the relationship, right? So they become somewhat captured by the US Air Force thinking. Again, understandable, because if you think about how this relationship developed, the ad hoc nature of the Air Force cooperation was so essential in the 40s and the 50s. But ultimately, Kennedy cancels Skybolt, and the Brits throw a huge fuss over it. This is, you know, the biggest thing since Suez, which was, of course, probably the other major factor, but that's not just nuclear, that's kind of everything. This is damning the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. It doesn't get a lot of attention, in part because it happens right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And everyone's kind of taking a deep, sigh of breath of relief after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Kennedy recognizes this is a very big issue and actually assigns Richard Neustadt, who's a political scientist at the time, to write up a whole study on why this type of negotiating dynamic and relationship can be so easily turned south. Like, what went wrong? We need an serious after action report. Kennedy's Neustadt's report on that is actually went on to be published by Cornell some years later as essential study on Skybolt. But look, I mean, the British were being a little bit dishonest. Once they kind of realized it was going to be canceled, they started to play it up in public to try to corner the Americans to giving them the Polaris system, which Kennedy wasn't initially prepared to do. But Harold Macmillan, who was the PM at the time, kind of pulled on the heartstrings, and Kennedy was susceptible in that way. But the issue on the kind of observation effect that I talked about earlier, what kind of breaks trust between the US and British government, or one of the final straws, actually enhances the trust of the British public in the American government. And that is McNamara steps off the tarmac in late 1962, essentially kind of give the bad news to his counterparts in London, and the press is waiting for him. And he goes off. He says, this program, this Skyball program is not going to work. It's full of complications, and don't get your hopes up. And so the British public start to trust the American government more than they trust their own on the nuclear program, which is actually in some ways a paradox in the relationship. Because one of the reasons the American government trusts the British government so much, ever since the spy scandals, the British have really cracked down on kind of their regime of secrecy. Now there have been leaks and there have been problems and whatnot over the years, but they've made a serious effort. David Owen said this exactly in the 1980s, right after he had been Minister of Defense, that it is like British commitment to nuclear secrecy that gains the American government's trust. But it also loses the trust of the British public, right? Which then creates kind of major crises of the 1980s between the kind of pro-nuclear Thatcher government and the anti-nuclear Labour Party and CND and all those other things. So a lot of kind of interesting dynamics here at play. Yeah, Aaron's running it all.
Love the talk and look forward to buying the book, Anthony. Thank you. Can you say, historian's question here, can you say a little bit about sources? When I've worked in the UK National Archives, there are 3 things that you cannot read. And usually they are royals, espionage, and nukes.
Yeah.
So you've written a book about one of these.
Yeah, I mean, so part of this, John and I had both been working on various issues, nuclear weapons, United Kingdom, United States for a long time. So part of this was kind of back burner research, if you will. I'll say a little thing about sources, particularly, if you look at the earlier years, early Cold War, it's easy. There's actually a lot of armchair research to be done, so to speak, in the National Security Archive, Fruce Online, whatnot, but you shouldn't just rely on that armchair research. The oral histories at the AIP, American Institute for Physics, for example, are searchable, very easy to read. It gives you really an insight into the technical minds. John had this kind of wealth of back burner research. So that's early Cold War. When you get into the kind of later periods of the Cold War, 70s and 80s, specifically the 80s, you've probably heard me go on this rant before. There are digital archives, British documentary, British overseas documents, are CD-ROMs that are available through most libraries, very good. The Thatcher archive, very good, but here's the problem, and I think you and I have talked about this too, is people become over-reliant on the Thatcher archive because it's so wonderfully digitized, but it only gives the Prime Minister's office point of view. And fail to consult the kind of Foreign Office records, the MOD records, the Home Office records that exist at Kew. So we did dive into those records. Yeah, there's still a lot classified, but the British are a little better at opening up documents on nuclear issues than the Americans. And then lastly, as we got kind of post-Cold War, yeah, you got to rely on some kind of journalistic accounts and whatnot, but we did our best to kind of interview key people. One of those people would be Frank Miller. And Frank is, kind of the high priest of the nuclear priesthood in the United States around today. I mean, there have been other high priests from time to time, but Frank is probably among, to my mind, one of the most knowledgeable people on the history of U.S. nuclear policy in the last 30, 40 years. So it was a mixed bag. Archives, published studies. I mean, some of this work is synthetic, right? I mean, it's a big book. It's an 80-year history. There's been a lot of people written on it. So a lot of the work is synthesis, but we did do our best to supplement with archival.
So I just want to intervene here because I think that the sourcing question is really important. One comment and then a question. The comment is, I'm oftentimes told, because Anglo-American nuclear cooperation is one of my favorite topics, people say, well, why are you writing about that? Hasn't that been covered? I mean, people have been writing about that for decades. But in the last couple of years, so much has been declassified that really causes us to question some of the assumptions about the relationship in key periods of time. But the question is, building off of the source questions, is about the Moscow criteria.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things we would all love to see in the UK National Archives is what was the actual criteria that was put forward to ensure the credibility of the UK nuclear deterrent. And why I ask this is, when you look in the Soviet archives, the British nuclear deterrent almost never comes up. And so there's this bigger question, is the deterrent just purely a political tool or does it actually buttress the deterrence capabilities of the transatlantic alliance? And that is to say, did it actually matter? There's British views on credibility, but do you think it actually mattered as a tool of deterrence to the alliance?
Okay, so let me make sure I have the question right. What were our sources, primary sources on the Moscow criteria, or how did we see the Moscow criteria play out in defense and political terms?
Yeah, since we can't actually see what the Moscow criteria was, how do you actually see the deterrent
Yeah.
as a tool?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think, my general view of things is that nuclear weapons are political weapons, highly effective political weapons. That's not to understate their potential military applications. But they've long been used as political weapons. It's interesting, US and UK deterrence policies are not the same. You know this. The UK has long been based minimum deterrence. But more to the point, UK deterrence is and targeting policy is a little more ambiguous. So what is the Moscow criteria, by the way, that Aaron's referring to? It really is about how can Britain launch an effective nuclear strike against the Soviet Union with a limited nuclear arsenal that also counteracts the advances in ballistic missile defense systems that happened in the late 60s and 70s. And it's happened specifically around this conversation about what I was talking about earlier, Poseidon MIRV missile, the Cheverline program, et cetera. And so, how do you kind of better tailor British nuclear capabilities to its deterrence policy? I will say that I think as you get into the 1980s, Russian read on British nuclear deterrence and targeting doctrine gets very confused. Very confused because they're not sure about, are the British trying to kind of launch a cooperative, or not a cooperative, but a tandem strike with the US that, hits as many targets as possible, or is it, it's a question of countervailing versus counter force that Moscow is not really able to get a good read on with the Brits, I'd say. But I don't know if that's a really good answer to your question. And I don't know if I have a really good answer to your question, frankly. Do you have a good answer to your question?
No.
All right, so Aaron and I are going to put our heads together on this. And
I've been asking for years now. I think question over here.
So you mentioned Reagan's nuclear policy evolution, and I was wondering what allowed for Thatcher's strategic decision to not fight publicly against Reagan when it came to his evolution of nuclear policy, because other leaders like the South Korean leader and the Japanese leaders are currently publicly making statements. Was it Reagan's achievement at the end?
yeah, I mean, part of this is you kind of stick with the person who brought you to the dance, right? Like Thatcher had already put her trust in Reagan's nuclear policies beginning of the term with Trident, the INF. And so when SDI comes along, there are serious technical and commercial reservations that Thatcher has. But I think she thinks about the relationship in broader terms beyond, is SDI a net positive or a net negative for Britain? I think she thinks about, is the relationship with the United States, and is the relation in political terms, is the relationship between British conservatism and American conservatism a net positive for the UK or for Britain? And then lastly, this gets to the point of how Thatcher sees herself. Thatcher very much tried to style herself as this kind of broker of superpower affairs, right? As this key interview. And opening up daylight between her and Reagan would have essentially robbed her of that status as being the key intermediary between, at 85, Gorbachev and Reagan, but not just Gorbachev and Reagan, Gorbachev's predecessors, the sickly kind of Soviet premier, trio of sickly Soviet premiers. So, it's not a calculation that's rooted strictly in kind of nuclear policy. I will say that how she kind of fends off people in her own government who are saying, British support for SDI is not a good idea. She really very strongly kind of lays down a marker and says, I have a degree in chemistry from Oxford. I'm the technical expert. And I think she says this kind of verbatim. You civil servants don't know anything about what you're talking about. And so just know if you have an undergraduate degree in chemistry from Oxford, you are very much on firm ground when you talk about advanced nuclear technologies and ballistic missile defense systems. I mean, I jest, but she's making, in my mind, the right political calculations for Britain at the time. And I think, it's pretty clear that you look at the literature, maybe this is my own bias, but Britain plays a major role in the end of the Cold War, and that's because Britain tacks closely to the trade administration. So.
Thanks. You said that the Sea Freeze brought US and Britain closer together. Did it help on the Russian side? Did it help give them confidence in ending the Cold War? That the public was against the nukes? Or?
Yeah, that was the old Russian playbook, right? Try to use the anti-nuclear movement to kind of crack public support for nuclear deterrence and upgrades to the US and British nuclear arsenal. And both Thatcher government and the Reagan administration kind of make claims that, those peace movements have been infiltrated. I will say that those weren't validated. But Gorbachev very much sees the scientific community as a potential kind of disruptor in American nuclear policies. He very much engages them for that purpose. If you read kind of Gorbachev's memoirs and the literature, or the memoirs of some of his advisors, they make very clear that kind of anti-nuclear, or let's say freeze scientists, what's the word I'm looking for? Scientists who look favorably upon the freeze are key interlocutors in their kind of approach to arms control. And I think the most telling example is Gorbachev releases kind of a nuclear policy statement, basically an arms control negotiating position. I believe before, which summit would have been? Probably before the Washington summit, well, maybe before Reykjavik. I can't remember precisely right now. And it's an exact replication of the text of the Pugwash Creed. So he's trying to track closely to this kind of growing group of scientists who are skeptical about Reagan's arms control policies, and sees this as an opportunity to kind of crack consensus. The U.S. State Department is very concerned about this, by the way. It sends around circular after circular about, beware of how the Soviets engage the scientific community, because it's not just Pugwash. There are other groups. Carl Sagan's talking about nuclear winter at this time, and that creates connections with Soviet scientists who supposedly validate and vindicate the modeling underpinning nuclear winter theory. So it is a Soviet strategy to engage the scientific community to disrupt consensus about nuclear deterrence in the U.S.
Disruption have an influence on the end of the Cold War?
Yes, I would say yes. Right. I think ultimately the strategy kind of works both ways. If you read Gorbachev closely, I mean, look, it wouldn't be the first time I've been conned by a politician. But I think Gorbachev does start to see a little wisdom in scientific warnings about arms race. And so it's not that Gorbachev's just listening to Reagan about, maybe we should, work to end the nuclear arms race. He's listening to other Western sources as well. And I think the scientific community is very much one of those sources. And then, of course, Chernobyl is kind of a big watershed moment. I will say Gorbachev had already made up his mind that they should start pursuing serious nuclear reductions before Chernobyl, the reason why it's a watershed moment, it's the moment in which the Americans think that Gorbachev has made a pivot and is thus amenable to discussing real reductions in nuclear arms. So it doesn't work quite the way people think it's worked, right? But it works nonetheless. Other questions?
I hope you don't mind me asking you this question. So fast forward to 2024, given the number of players and Iran and North Korea wanting to have missiles, nuclear missiles. So how much of a concern it should be for this current generation?
Nuclear proliferation, how much should we be concerned? Oh man, I mean, I'll just tongue in cheek, my wife works in kind of environmental activism, and I've studied nuclear weapons for years, and we always joke that we both wake up thinking about the end of the world on a daily basis. It gets kind of tiring. No, I mean, I think it's a very serious problem. I mean, the idea that the kind of end country problem that was first identified in the 60s. Are we going to wake up in a world 15 years from now where there are 25 nuclear powers, and where command and control infrastructure isn't nearly as sophisticated as it is in the United States, which, by the way, has had its own share of nuclear accidents, right? Even with kind of Putin's nuclear saber rattling, I'm still not too concerned about the possibility of nuclear war between the kind of classical nuclear weapon states as identified in the NPT. I am worried about the possibility of accidental nuclear war in countries that have somewhat unstable political systems and less sophisticated command and control structures in place. Is there a way to work toward it or to resolve it? I mean, I think this is the case of it's just kind of everyone's responsibility to start talking about nuclear weapons more generally. It's a topic that has really much taken a back seat, right, to concerns about AI. I think it really is the kind of overarching concern for people in the kind of national security technology space, and concerns about climate change. I think those are the two kind of big existential crises or looming crises that people think about nowadays. But nuclear weapons, I wish people would talk more about. So, yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but yes, I'm worried about it.
Thank you so much for the presentation. As I was listening to this, and especially the trust aspect of things, I was thinking a lot about kind of emerging technologies with growing security applications in the future, and what are the lessons learned. So for instance, looking at quantum computing and kind of the scale up of that, and that having increasing security implications and military applications in the future, what are the lessons we can take from how trust is developed and how trust kind of shows up in those relationships?
Yeah, and just to make sure I heard correctly, you said quantum computing, not AI.
Well, you can talk about both, definitely. I was kind of thinking we maybe have a little bit more of an understanding of what AI will bring, and quantum has more still of that. Where will it take us and how quickly element?
Yeah, one article I've been thinking about writing lately is there a way to think historically about AI? And I'm not convinced there is yet. And I think it's a mistake to use the nuclear analogy for AI. So I'll just go on record saying that. Every generation there's someone who says there is something new under the sun, and I don't think there is often something new under the sun, but I think the idea that another intelligence exists apart from human form, biological intelligence rather, is something new under the sun. On quantum, I think it's a little different, and I think the framework actually still kind of works, right? Yeah, there's going to be concerns over commercial competition, but JOWGs, joint working groups, that's a great way to institutionalize cooperation. right, on quantum issues. Right? This is really, it's not rocket science. I mean, sometimes it is rocket science, but it's not too hard to understand that you just need to get people in the room working on the same problem set, who then can translate its value, its proper application in their societies back home. Right? And I also would say that, look, the cultural interpenetration between British and American society is a lot different today than it was in the 1940s, right? You can call anyone across the Atlantic on WhatsApp for, basically no charge. You can text, you can social media, you can write an email, you can watch Netflix The Crown together at the exact same time by syncing up, right? There's just a lot more free flow communication. So it's a lot easier to have these conversations together. And I would say in the aftermath of Brexit, I'm not going to state whether or not that was a good thing for Britain. Well, actually, I will. I think it was a bad thing for Britain. But in the aftermath of Brexit, I think the British are much more willing to have those conversations in even more robust firms and with the United States and with American counterparts. And places like GW have a role to play, right? By partnering with universities in the UK, where quantum is a real issue. On SDI, this was actually a big concern too. You need to think about export control restrictions, right? So on SDI, the big concern was there's only so much technical talent in the UK. There's so much coding talent, people who are capable of building advanced architectures to support SDI. And at the same time, the European market was seeking to develop kind of commercial applications or next generation computing, right? So the British had a real kind of decision to make about, should we shift our technical talent into the SDI program to meet kind of American security objectives, or should we shift our technical talent into kind of the European common market objectives, right? This is the classic dual use technology dilemma. But again, I think it's less of a problem for the Brits now because of Brexit, right? They've kind of made their bed. And so now they have to sleep in it, for example. But yeah, quantum is, I think, very much has kind of applications that we can draw. And one of the things is you have to learn to live with ambiguity, right? And that's, if an alliance is going to last 80 years, it has to be flexible. And that means learning to live with ambiguity, learning to accept ad hoc arrangements as they are, not always pushing for that formalized agreement. Yes, they have to come, and they often have to come when there's a question of hardware exchange, right? But they don't always have to come, right? So keeping that in mind is a good.
One last question from the online audience, from former GW professor Hugh Gusterson. Every new British prime minister writes a letter to Trident submarine commanders telling them what they should do if contact with the British government is lost, i.e. if the UK has been under nuclear attack. What do we know about the content of those letters? Will they ever be available to historians? Does the US government know anything about their contents?
Hugh, thanks for chiming in and for watching. All my students in the audience know Hugh because I always assign something he's written. I'm going to disappoint you here. I don't know the contents of those letters. Do you, Aaron? I don't know if we will. The person who actually would have the best answer to this is the other author on this book, and that's John Bales, who I suspect also doesn't know the kind of content of those letters. Will they ever come out? I doubt it. Yeah, I mean, you might get a sub-commander, kind of off the record, but yeah, those aren't.
Well, and if the British sub-commanders are following the rules, which, sometimes Royal Naval officers are a little fast and loose with the rules, but still, if they're following the rules, they're not supposed to ever look at the letters of last resort.
That's right. That's right.
I'm a colonial naval officer, retired commander. And while I have no clue what's in those letters, it would seem to me that if a sub-commander or any military type commander lost touch with his chain of command, he would go to an alternate chain of command. For Great Britain, it's easy, it's the NATO chain of command. Am I being naive or simplistic or what?
I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect the letters of last resort could have those contingencies. Lose touch with all alternative chains of command as well. And of course, Trident boats are assigned to the NATO deterrence mission. So, and yeah, like you said, they're burned.
Well, yeah, I mean, if, the British documents on nuclear command and control, they're all completely unavailable. I think one of the great things about Anthony's talk is it highlights there's certain areas in which the UK is far more transparent than the US on nuclear issues. And there's certain areas like nuclear command and control where the UK is far less transparent, and NC3 is one of those areas. Right. Well, Anthony, again, thanks so much for this talk. And I think one of the things that really comes out of it is the importance of it for thinking about current alliance dynamics, not just with the UK, but also in the context of AUKUS. And one thing that Anthony is too humble to say, but I will say for him, is that this book is really at the forefront of a whole new wave of scholarship on Anglo-American nuclear cooperation and really capitalizing on some of these recently available documents. So really applaud the effort. Thanks so much.